The House chamber was filled with quiet tension as Speaker Mike Johnson stepped up to the podium, his expression marked by an unusual resolve. The C-SPAN camera focused on him as he adjusted his tie and scanned the room with the practiced authority of his office. "Before we move forward with today's business," Johnson began, his Louisiana accent slightly stronger than usual, "I feel compelled to address the remarks made yesterday by the gentlewoman from Texas concerning our judicial nomination process." The chamber fell silent. Lawmakers from both sides looked up from their phones and papers, sensing this was not a routine announcement. Johnson rarely used the speaker's platform for personal commentary, making his tone all the more surprising. "Representative Crockett's comments yesterday," he continued, his voice firm as he looked directly at Jasmine Crockett across the chamber, "revealed not only a misunderstanding of our constitutional responsibilities, but also a troubling pattern of inflammatory rhetoric that has marked her short time in this body." Soft murmurs rippled through the room. It was unusual, almost unheard of, for a speaker to single out a member in this way. Yet Johnson pressed on. "I have reviewed the gentlewoman's record, both here in Congress and in her prior career," he said, his tone sharpening, "and I find it deeply concerning that someone whose professional background largely involved defending criminal defendants in Texas courtrooms now feels qualified to lecture this body on constitutional interpretation." Gasps followed. Johnson had crossed an unwritten boundary, using the speaker's podium, typically reserved for maintaining decorum, to attack a member's professional history. "The American people deserve representatives who appreciate the seriousness of their office and the constitutional principles it upholds," Johnson declared, his voice rising slightly, not individuals chasing viral moments through divisive rhetoric. As the words hung in the air, the cameras turned toward Jasmine Crockett. The 42-year-old freshman representative from Texas's 30th District sat motionless, her face calm and unreadable. Senior Democrats leaned toward her, whispering, but she quietly motioned them away. Without looking away from Johnson, Crockett pressed the button to request speaking time. The chamber fell silent again as her name appeared on the screen. Johnson, momentarily caught off guard, nodded in acknowledgement. "The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas for 1 minute," he said, reverting to the formal tone of procedure that sharply contrasted with his earlier remarks. Crockett stood deliberately, smoothed her blazer, and walked toward the microphone. The chamber was utterly still. "Mr. Speaker," she began, her voice even and controlled, "I thank you for allowing me the chance to respond to your description of my background and my comments on our constitutional responsibilities." She paused, meeting his gaze. "And I assure you, sir, the next 30 seconds will clearly show which one of us truly understands the Constitution we both swore to defend." The digital clock began counting down her single minute as the chamber held its breath. What followed would reshape Washington's political conversation in ways few had predicted. Mike Johnson's rise to the Speaker's chair had been both rapid and unexpected. After the chaotic removal of Kevin McCarthy and several failed nominations, Johnson, a relatively low-profile conservative from Louisiana's 4th District, emerged as a unifying choice among a divided Republican conference. At 51, his ascent from an under-the-radar lawmaker to third in line for the presidency had surprised many, including himself. Before his election to Congress in 2017, Johnson had made his name as a constitutional lawyer with the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative Christian legal group focused on religious liberty cases. He often cited this work as proof of his deep, constitutional expertise. "I've spent my professional life studying and defending the Constitution," he frequently reminded both colleagues and constituents. Since assuming the Speaker's gavel, Johnson had faced a delicate balancing act, appeasing the hard-right faction of his party while managing a razor-thin majority that demanded near total unity on every vote. Recent weeks had tested him especially hard, as contentious Supreme Court confirmation hearings took over Washington's agenda. Johnson had positioned Republican opposition as a matter of constitutional duty, warning against judicial activism. A day earlier, however, Representative Crockett had challenged that framing during a Judiciary Committee hearing. She argued that Johnson's interpretation was selective and politically motivated, even pointing out inconsistencies with his prior statements about judicial nominees under the previous administration. Her remarks went viral, gaining traction on social media and major news outlets. For Johnson, whose reputation as a constitutional authority was central to his political identity, this was a direct challenge he couldn't ignore. With pressure mounting from within his own conference to assert leadership strength, Johnson made the rare decision to publicly confront Crockett from the speaker's podium. Across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett watched him with calm focus, the composure of a trial, attorney used to high-stakes confrontations. Her journey to Congress represented a new kind of political path, one shaped by activism and community advocacy, rather than establishment politics. After earning her law degree from the University of Houston, she built a respected civil rights practice in Dallas, focusing on police misconduct, voting rights, and criminal defense. Her work had often placed her directly against powerful institutions, experience that now served her well in the political arena. Her most recognized accomplishments included securing the release of 3 wrongfully convicted men who had collectively served 52 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. These cases exposed major prosecutorial misconduct and led to meaningful reforms in Texas's criminal justice system. After serving in the Texas House of Representatives, where she gained national attention for her strong defense of voting rights during divisive debates on election laws, Crockett won a seat in Congress in 2022. At 42, she brought to Washington both substantial constitutional litigation experience and a direct, no-nonsense approach shaped by years of challenging entrenched systems. "I didn't come to Congress to make friends or play politics as usual," she had told supporters during her campaign. "I came to speak truth to power and fight for those excluded from the national conversation for far too long." For Crockett, Johnson's criticism was not simply personal. It misrepresented the constitutional principles that guided her entire legal career. Having litigated constitutional cases in federal courts, including a voting rights dispute before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, she viewed Johnson's claim of constitutional superiority as not only inaccurate, but professionally insulting. The stakes of this moment extended far beyond the 2 figures involved. For Republicans, Johnson's authority as Speaker depended on maintaining credibility and respect in the chamber. For Democrats, Crockett symbolized a new generation of lawmakers unafraid to challenge authority through legal precision rather than political rhetoric. For the American public, many watching the live C-SPAN broadcast, the confrontation highlighted broader questions about qualifications, expertise, and who holds the right to define constitutional authority in national politics. The House chamber, now filled beyond capacity, buzzed with anticipation as members streamed in to witness the unprecedented exchange between the Speaker and a freshman representative. Senior party leaders on both sides watched intently, aware that this moment could alter internal power dynamics. As Crockett stood at the microphone, her allotted minute already running, the contrast between her and Johnson was striking. Johnson, the relatively new Speaker, commanded the institutional power of the elevated podium. Crockett, with limited political seniority but greater courtroom experience in constitutional matters, now had exactly 60 seconds to respond to a public dismissal of her legal background and expertise. What Johnson had not expected was that in questioning her constitutional knowledge, he had entered territory where Crockett was most skilled, and where his own record contained weaknesses she had already studied with the precision of a trial attorney. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her voice steady and composed as she addressed him directly, "since you've questioned both my understanding of constitutional principles and my legal experience, I believe clarification is needed for this chamber and the American people." Standing firm at the microphone, she met his gaze. "You described my career as one spent primarily defending criminals in Texas courtrooms. While I am proud of my work protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans, a cornerstone of our justice system, the majority of my legal career was devoted to civil rights advocacy." Her tone remained professional, yet carried a sharper conviction. "I litigated voting rights cases that secured ballot access for thousands of citizens. I pursued police misconduct cases that held power accountable and reformed departmental policies across jurisdictions. And yes, I defended individuals whose constitutional rights were violated, including 3 men who were later exonerated after spending more than 5 decades combined in prison for crimes they did not commit." The chamber had gone silent. Members from both parties listened closely, as Johnson kept his expression neutral, though his posture stiffened as Crockett calmly corrected his portrayal of her background. "You implied that my constitutional understanding is lacking," she continued. "Perhaps this is an appropriate time to compare our records." She glanced briefly at her notes before looking up. "In 2020, you stated that the president has nearly unlimited authority in foreign affairs, a claim the Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected in landmark rulings from Youngstown Steel to Zivotofsky, which clearly define limits on executive power." A low murmur spread through the chamber. Constitutional experts among the members immediately recognized the references. Johnson shifted slightly as she pressed forward. "In your amicus brief in Texas versus Pennsylvania, you argued that one state could challenge another's election procedures, a position so inconsistent with basic constitutional federalism that the Supreme Court, including all 3 justices appointed by the president you supported, unanimously rejected it." Gasps echoed through the room. By referencing Johnson's post-election legal involvement, Crockett had addressed one of the most sensitive points in his record, rarely discussed in public proceedings. "You promoted a constitutional theory so deeply flawed that not one justice, regardless of appointment, accepted it," she said firmly. "Is that the constitutional expertise you suggest I lack, Mr. Speaker?" The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted entirely. What began as a one-sided rebuke from the Speaker had become a precise constitutional examination, catching him visibly off guard. Senior Republicans began signaling to the parliamentary staff, seemingly seeking a procedural end to the exchange. "You accused me of misrepresenting our constitutional responsibilities on judicial nominations," Crockett continued, referencing Johnson's earlier remarks. "Yet in 2016, you claimed the Senate had no obligation to consider a Supreme Court nominee during an election year. In 2020, you argued the Senate had a constitutional duty to do so." She paused briefly. "Both positions cannot be correct. The Constitution doesn't shift based on which party controls the Senate or the White House." The timer showed she had used 40 seconds of her allotted minute. As she prepared her final remarks, the room was silent. Johnson, now visibly uneasy, appeared to consider whether to use his gavel to interrupt, an act that could halt her response, but also confirm her argument about selective constitutional interpretation. Before he could act, Crockett delivered her final and most forceful point. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, "you questioned my understanding of the Constitution. But as someone who has actually argued and won constitutional cases in federal courts on behalf of Americans whose rights were denied, I must ask, how many constitutional cases have you personally litigated and won in federal court?" The question hung in the air, and every member in the chamber already knew the answer. Despite Johnson's frequent claims of constitutional expertise, his legal background was rooted mainly in state court cases centered on religious liberty, not in federal constitutional litigation. Crockett, by contrast, had built her entire legal career on federal constitutional cases, a fact her colleagues were well aware of, though she rarely highlighted it unless directly challenged. The 10-second warning light illuminated on her microphone, signaling her time was nearly up. She had saved her strongest argument for the closing moments. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, her voice now steady and resolute, "there's a significant difference between quoting the Constitution and actually defending it in federal court on behalf of citizens whose rights are being violated." She paused briefly, her tone calm but unwavering, as silence filled the chamber. "While you've often used the Constitution as a rhetorical tool to advance a political agenda, I've used it as a shield to protect voting rights, ensure due process, and uphold equal protection for Americans whose constitutional rights were denied." The room remained silent. In one statement, Crockett not only defended her record, but reframed the exchange as a contrast between theoretical rhetoric and practical defense of constitutional law. "My understanding of our founding document," she continued, "comes not from selective quotations, but from standing beside citizens whose rights were being actively violated. Black voters removed from rolls, defendants denied fair trials, and individuals subjected to excessive force by the state. The power dynamic in the chamber had completely shifted. Despite Johnson's elevated position at the speaker's podium, all eyes were now on Crockett. Her command of constitutional principles and her first-hand experience had transformed her from the subject of criticism into the authoritative voice in the room. "You referenced my work in criminal defense as though it undermines my constitutional understanding," Crockett said, her tone sharpening but remaining composed. "Those defendants were Americans, presumed innocent under our Constitution, including 3 men I helped exonerate after they spent decades in prison for crimes they did not commit because their constitutional rights were violated." Johnson remained motionless, aware that interrupting her now would only emphasize her argument about selective constitutional application. On the Democratic side, members leaned forward, witnessing what many would later describe as a pivotal moment in congressional history. "The Constitution isn't just words to recite, Mr. Speaker," she continued. "It represents promises that power will be restrained, rights will be protected, and justice will be accessible to all Americans, not only those who look like you or share your personal beliefs." Crockett's allotted time was nearly over, but she delivered her closing statement with the precision of an attorney and the conviction of someone who had spent her life defending those promises. "So yes, Mr. Speaker," she said firmly, "let's review our constitutional records. Let's compare who has actually stood in federal court defending constitutional rights against who has merely claimed expertise while promoting theories rejected by every level of the judiciary. Because the difference between us isn't that you know the Constitution better. It's that I've used it to secure justice for Americans whose rights were denied by people who share your selective interpretation of our founding document." The red warning light flashed on her microphone. Crockett nodded respectfully. "You questioned my qualifications from that podium," she concluded. "But perhaps, Mr. Speaker, instead of questioning my understanding of the Constitution, you should reflect on how your own constitutional arguments have been unanimously rejected by our nation's highest court." I yield back. As Crockett returned to her seat, the Democratic side of the chamber rose in a standing ovation, a rare break in decorum that reflected both the intensity of Johnson's earlier remarks and the power of her response. Several moderate Republicans remained seated, deep in thought, while others looked visibly uneasy. Johnson, still at the podium, appeared momentarily stunned by the constitutional challenge to his authority. His aides approached with notes, likely containing suggested procedural steps or talking points to regain control. But the impact had already settled. In less than a minute of measured substantive response, Representative Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her constitutional record but had called into question Johnson's own claims of expertise. What began as an attempt to publicly undermine a junior member had turned into a defining moment of his speakership, broadcast, lived to millions of Americans now able to decide for themselves who demonstrated true constitutional understanding within minutes. Clips of the exchange were circulating across every major news and social media platform. The hashtag #JoshConstitutionalClapback quickly climbed to the #1 trending topic worldwide as footage of Congresswoman Crockett's calm, methodical dismantling of Speaker Johnson's constitutional claims hit 30 million views by evening. A split-screen meme comparing Johnson's confident attack to his stunned reaction moments later went viral. Captioned, "When you bring a speech to a constitutional fight." Major networks rapidly adjusted their programming, interrupting regular broadcasts with breaking reports. Unprecedented clash, Speaker Johnson attacks Rep. Crockett. Receives constitutional lesson in return. CNN's ticker read, Speaker questions Congresswoman's legal background. She responds with constitutional masterclass. Even Fox News aired the headline, House floor confrontation raises questions about Speaker's authority. Constitutional law professors and former federal judges quickly filled panel discussions across major networks. What we saw today wasn't just politics, explained a Harvard law professor on MSNBC. It was the distinction between talking about the Constitution and actually defending it in court. The moment where Crockett asked how many federal constitutional cases Johnson had personally litigated became an instant classic in congressional history. Law professors across the country immediately stated they would include the exchange in their courses on constitutional advocacy. Outside the Capitol, the press surrounded members exiting the chamber. When Crockett appeared, flanked by Democratic colleagues, reporters shouted questions from every direction. "Congresswoman, did you expect Speaker Johnson's remarks? Were you prepared for that constitutional debate? Will you seek a formal censure for his use of the podium?" Crockett paused, calm amid the chaos. "Today's exchange was unfortunate but necessary," she began. "When the Speaker of the House uses his position to question a member's professional record and understanding of the Constitution, it requires a serious response. I'd prefer to debate such matters in a more appropriate forum, but I'll always defend both my record and my understanding of our founding document when directly challenged." With that, she walked away as reporters rushed to publish their stories. Meanwhile, Johnson canceled his scheduled press briefing, his office citing scheduling conflicts, a claim few found credible given the day's events. Back in the Capitol, the political impact was immediate. Senior Democrats who once saw Crockett as a progressive newcomer were now recognizing her as a skilled constitutional expert with strong composure under pressure. "What Representative Crockett showed today wasn't just sharp rhetoric," said the House Democratic leader. "It was precise constitutional reasoning delivered with integrity. That's leadership." Privately, several Republicans acknowledged how effectively Crockett had handled the confrontation and how poorly Johnson had miscalculated. "He picked the wrong person," one veteran GOP lawmaker admitted. "She's actually litigated these issues. It's like challenging Steph Curry to a three-point contest. Within hours, whispers spread across Republican circles. Some moderates expressed quiet concern over Johnson's decision to use his position for a personal attack. Even members of the Freedom Caucus began questioning whether Johnson truly possessed the constitutional expertise he'd claimed during his speakership campaign. By evening, Johnson released a written statement. "While I stand by my concern about rhetoric that weakens our institutions, I regret that today's exchange distracted from Congress's important work. I have reached out to Representative Crockett to discuss moving forward productively." The carefully phrased message, part defense, part deflection, satisfied no one, fueling even more discussion. Constitutional scholars continued dissecting Crockett's remarks, confirming that her reference to Johnson's amicus brief in Texas versus Pennsylvania was both factually correct and revealing of his narrow interpretation of constitutional law. For Crockett, the incident transformed her national image. Her office was flooded with interview requests from outlets that had previously overlooked her. Law journals sought her essays on constitutional advocacy, and universities invited her to speak about constitutional responsibility. "This wasn't just about one moment or one speaker," Crockett explained in her first in-depth interview afterward. "It's about challenging the idea that only certain people get to define constitutional authority. That document belongs to every American, not just those who use it selectively for ideology." Meanwhile, Johnson faced increasing consequences. His approval among Republican voters slipped sharply, with critics citing concerns about his judgment and leadership. Behind closed doors, members questioned whether his constitutional claims could still be trusted. In the months that followed, Johnson's ability to lead on constitutional matters weakened noticeably. Democrats often cited the exchange when contesting his rulings, and even Republicans became more open in questioning his interpretations. 3 months later, during another major constitutional debate, Johnson quietly yielded the gavel to a deputy before speaking, an unspoken admission that his credibility on such issues had been damaged beyond repair. For observers and scholars alike, Crockett's response marked a rare congressional moment when genuine expertise outshined authority. "What Representative Crockett demonstrated," wrote a Yale Law Journal professor, "is that real constitutional dialogue requires more than credentials. It requires a deep, working understanding of the principles themselves." The broader message was clear. Underestimate Jasmine Crockett at your own risk. The Texas freshman had evolved from a new voice to a respected constitutional authority permanently, shifting who holds credibility in national debates. Before that exchange, noted a senior congressional aide in the Washington Post, Some could claim authority just based on background or ideology. Now there's a higher bar. You must be ready to defend your constitutional views on their merits, because someone like Crockett might expose your weaknesses for all to see. For everyday Americans, the viral exchange provided something rare, a moment where substance triumphed over spectacle. It reminded viewers that constitutional authority doesn't come from titles, seniority, or political alignment, but from the ability to apply founding principles to real American lives. In the end, the lesson was unmistakable. In America's ongoing constitutional conversation, what truly matters isn't who holds power, it's who understands how to use it to protect every citizen's rights. Subscribe for more political analysis and in-depth breakdowns. That moment when Jasmine Crockett revealed the difference between knowing the Constitution and defending it showed why authentic expertise will always outshine political theatrics. If you appreciated this deep dive into real congressional accountability, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Don't miss our upcoming feature. Top 10 Constitutional Clashes in Congress. Where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us if this was the most compelling congressional moment you've seen this year. Remember to like, share, and spread this video if you believe real constitutional understanding deserves the spotlight. See you in the next major political breakdown, where knowledge meets power.